Paul. It's a pleasure to greet you in the frameworks of international and interdisciplinary project titled Sketch a Subculture. And we're glad to greet you today. And since, Paul, you're an accomplished author, analytical journalist, political scientist, could you please share a little bit about yourself, about your journey? And particularly, if you don't mind telling about why you choose to become a writer.
Okay. Well, I mean, I grew up in upstate New York, but I had always had a great affinity to Europe and was always interested in European topics, be that literature, philosophy, and history. And so about as soon as I could, I made my way first to West Germany. And yeah, well, it was actually in West Berlin then. I ended up 85 and 86. And I was actually didn't think I wanted to be a writer. I was studying philosophy at the Free University and learning German. But it was really actually like 1989. I was in West Berlin, and a friend of mine I met in a bar, and she said she wanted to go to Hungary the next day. And I said, okay, well, I'll go too. And West Berlin was incredible for many different ways, and also, essential to the subcultures that thrived there. But one thing was that you could line up at the border where West Berlin was basically a city walled in East Germany. And you could go to the border, and all the cars had to line up because you had to get your passport stamped or whatever. So it was perfect for hitchhiking. And you just come and you stand in very orderly in a line, and just get picked up, and you could really just go just about anywhere in Europe if you were willing to wait a couple hours for a good ride. And so we went down to Budapest, and it was when the East German refugees, they were streaming through Hungary. They were escaping communist East Germany, and Hungary had then opened the border to Austria, and Budapest was just so cool and so happening, and it was just the right moment to be in Hungary at that time, October 1989. So we both decided to stay, and I just started writing then, and it's basically what I've ever done ever since.
Yeah. You have also different books that cover historical, sociological, political, and economical aspects, among others. Books as such, Fischer and the Making of the Berlin Republic, Free to Hate, Homeland Calling, Exile, Patriotism, and the Balkan Wars, Berlin Calling, Stories of Anarchy, Music, Subculture, and the Fall of the Wall, Germany from Below. So, Paul, what can you tell about subcultures of Germany in general and how they are different from other subcultures, particularly in the Northern America, just because you have grown up there and you have firsthand experience?
Yeah. There's actually an awful lot that joins the subcultures. For example, West Berlin and New York City were, some people lived between those two cities, and the punk rock scene and the art scene. So, there was actually a lot of very similar movements and thoughts going on in between Berlin. But I think it's best that I kind of concentrate on Berlin, because that's what I wrote my most recent book about. And the subculture in Berlin is actually influences go all the way back to the 1920s, the golden 20s in Berlin, where there were in addition to really interesting artistic scenes like the Expressionists, etc., there were sexual subcultures. There was a gay scene that was unimaginable anywhere else in the world, for example. And there was space for very creative people to do very creative things, and that, of course, was crushed by the Nazis. And yet, it revived. It came back in a way in West Berlin when the wall went up, and West Berlin became this this little kind of like biotope. It was closed off to the rest of the world. It was as far as you could go in the Western world. It was even further, and still yet, you know, be somewhere in the West. Although it wasn't the West. It attracted a very interesting group of people. I mean, there was those people who kind of lived in Berlin anyway, who were interesting just for that fact. I mean, they were the leftovers of the wars and the Reconstruction and everything else. And then a lot of interesting people showed up in Berlin, for example, gay men and women, because there was an anonymity in Berlin. I mean, as David Bowie said, he came as well, and Iggy Pop, and he said, you know, the great thing about Berlin is people don't give a shit about you. David Bowie could just be David Bowie; nobody cared. There was the freedom for sexual subcultures. It was also the case that being in West Berlin absolved any young men from West Germany of having to go into the draft, of having to serve in the army, because West Berlin was not under the law of West Germany. It was under the law of the British, of the French, and the American occupation troops, right up until when the wall fell. So there could be no West German army formed in West Berlin. So it was a place where you attracted. They don't have numbers, but definitely, you know, tens of thousands of young men came to West Berlin to get away from the draft. There was also a case that West Berlin had the Free University. This was actually, believe it or not, it was started up by the United States and the Ford Foundation. But it turned out the idea was to have a university that was very different than the old conservative, dyed-in-the-wool universities that came from the German tradition, and there were everywhere else, at least in Western Germany. And this attracted some very, very, you know, different people. It was also the case that it was very cheap to live in West Berlin. And this is also when I was there. I mean, you could get a flat for very little money. It was subsidized. Everything was subsidized there. I mean, West Berlin wouldn't have existed without the subsidies basically coming from West Germany. And they, of course, were subsidizing it so that people would stay there, and so that West Berlin could exist in some form. As strange as it was, you know, a lot of people didn't want to live there. It was rough. It was kind of gray, and you know, you were circled on all sides by East Germany and ultimately Soviet troops and tanks. If the Cold War had actually turned into a hot war, if there had been ever real shooting, West Berlin would have been flattened first. It would have been very easy for the Soviets to run it over. It probably wouldn't have, even with the American, British, and the French troops, wouldn't have lasted very long. So you have a very strange kind of person who would come to this little island, you know, in the middle of Eastern Germany. And then it also turned out that because the Free University was different and was into kind of different kinds of Marxist theory, it attracted a lot of students like that. And this, of course, you know, enabled the student movements in the late 1960s. When they took off, they took a particularly radical form in West Berlin. So all of these things kind of came together to make Berlin already very different, and the kind of people in West Berlin very different than those in Western Germany and elsewhere. And then came punk rock, and that was really from which then the subculture that from the 1980s that I knew and I actually think was most interesting when that came. And you know, it had its own bands like the Einstürzende Neubauten and its own clubs and you know, lots of different kind of impromptu grassroots organizations and, you know, galleries and museums and, you know, ateliers that artists had. I mean, whole houses were taken over. There was a huge squatter movement. So these things came together to make Berlin's subculture so political. And that's one of the things that I underline in the book, that one of the unique things about Berlin, it was always highly political. And the subculture it ran through the bands and the art scene and theater, absolutely everything.
So, coming from what you said, the description of Western Berlin in those times, could we say that basically that part was some kind of a subculture, Western Berlin subculture?
Yes, yes, absolutely. That's a good point. I mean, everybody in West Berlin was on the same page in a way, because of this the strange geopolitical situation that you were in. And yet there were, like, I'd say probably 3 or 4 different groups, all of which had nothing to do with one another, except for the fact that they were all stuck in this Cold War outpost. There were the Berliners, kind of straight-faced and grumpy. And there were then, like, the Turkish guest workers who had come to help Germany with economic labor shortfalls that would happen in the 70s, but they stayed and brought families, and so they were another part of Berlin, West Berlin. They didn't care about the ordinary Berliners, and the ordinary Berliners didn't care about them. And then there was the subculture, so mixture of students and anarchists and squatters, and that was yet another group, and they didn't care about these other 2 groups. So these, and then with the soldiers, of course, as well. So there were these kind of 4 different subcultures in Berlin that had nothing to do with one another. You could kind of just live in your own subculture in the the scene, what we called it, and go to the Free University and hang out in the bars or the cafes or whatever, and not really have anything to do at all with those other subcultures in Berlin.
This now it makes sense. Paul, so since subcultures are, I mean, this is that type of phenomena which is self-organized something. Nobody is in charge and organizes this. In your viewpoint, what allows these subcultures to continue their existence, like for a very long period of time, particularly the subcultures that you describe in the book? They have been existing from 60s, maybe even up until now. So what are the mechanisms inside of those subcultures that allow its existence?
Okay, good question. I think that there were a number of different things that enabled the subculture in Berlin to flourish. But I think the most important was there were a group of people who were very creative and very daring and were willing to live in kind of adverse circumstances, which West Berlin was, in order to do their own things. They had an idea, they had ideas, and they wanted to do them. And it was this very special mix of people that made, and I think makes all subcultures, particularly interesting or not. I mean, the quality, I think, comes from those people and what they're willing to risk. I think that's most important. As I said, West Berlin was, and still today, Berlin is a relatively inexpensive place to live compared to just about any other major city in the world. A point that I underscore in the book is that there was also Freiraum, or free space, to do things. There were, you could get your own apartment was easy to get, but also if you're an artist, so to get studio space. If you wanted to just almost like start up a shop or a kindergarten, or you needed practice space for your band or whatever, or to start an art gallery. The fact that there was this space, that there was lots of empty housing, was important for West Berlin. And then when the wall came down, of course, then there was all of this space in East Berlin. And of course, the most famous use of that was, of course, the big techno clubs like Tresor and the AWAC, and today Berghain, that took advantage of these crazy, big, desolate industrial spaces. So that space is also something that And then, as I say as well, I mean, the politics were always really important. And West Berlin was inherently a very political place. And then the wall falls. And I mean, we're right now, Berlin is still closer to Poland than it is to what was West Germany in the past. And so, I mean, lots of different Eastern European peoples live here now. I mean, there's a whole group of Hungarian exiles and Polish exiles, and who are politicals who could no longer handle it, no longer deal with the political situations in their countries. So these exiles, these people from other countries, have also come very important as well. I think, and like in the book, I also emphasized that the coming of punk rock at the tail end of the 70s. It came late to West Berlin, but it took West Berlin off in a very different way, and it was absolutely crucial to the aesthetic and the sound and the different subcultural formations that happened in the 80s, and that still have impact today.
Do I understand correctly from what you said that the main thing that what keeps a subculture to continue its existence is an idea? Because you said that politics is so important for them. So basically, is that idea is what keeps its existence in your view?
Ideas. Original and creative ideas from original and creative people who are able to bring others together. And I mean, I can think of some of the biggest and most famous, like Dmitry Hegeman, who is known as the owner and founder of the techno club Tresor, but he was also lived in West Berlin and had all kinds of funky Dadaist projects, and he was very explicitly, like other people as well, kind of reaching back to Dada and the 20s and the really unique subculture then, and they were recreating a lot of it, and that continuity from basically from the Dadaists through to the Situationists, who were really important in the 60s, to the punk rock. I know this is Brian Marcus's thesis, and I think you can even draw a line then to the techno clubs or to the computer chaos club or some of these different anarchist organizations today. Yeah, it's the ideas. It's original ideas and people who dare to throw all caution to the side and to do it, to make it happen. It's not about voyeurs. It's about people doing it themselves. It's do it yourself.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. And can we perceive subcultures as certain machines that shape personalities of people?
In a way. But that's the less interesting. I'm more interested in how the personalities shape the subculture than the other way around. Because of course there are voyeurs and people who hang on and people on the margin of the scenes. And that's okay too. You gotta have somebody fill the ranks of a club. If a band's gonna play, you've gotta have a couple hundred people there. So that's important. And so they are, aesthetics, etc., are of course. Like the post-punk and the new wave aesthetic was very important, and still is, as a matter of fact. But I think it's what's most interesting is the personalities that shape the subculture, not the other way around.
Mm-hmm. I understand. And do you think the history of the nation plays a key role in determining the philosophy of subcultures?
Yes, it would have to, just because the structures of the nation state are so important. In Germany, it's particularly important because the subcultures were always a reaction against the Nazis and the dictatorship of both Hitler Germany and that in East Germany as well. And almost any culture in Germany since the Second World War has had to deal with the questions of the nation and the nation's complicity in the crimes of the Third Reich, and coming to grips with what it means to be German. So I mean, and thus, so punk rock was, there's complete rejection of the nation, for example. I would say most of Berlin's subcultures, dealt, very critically with the history of the nation, the German nation, what it means to be German, Germanness, and contemporary history. So it's absolutely critical to all of the subcultures that are worth anything. If they don't deal with these topics in Germany, then they're really not worth even taking note of.
From your experience from subcultures that you have seen, what kind of myths or legends have you seen to be in the core of it, if any?
Yeah, well, sure there are myths. I mean, I already mentioned, that in West Berlin there was this link, or many people felt there was this link to the 20s, and to, for example, the Berlin of Christopher Isherwood, his Berlin stories, and they wanted that. And so and yet there also was a connection. There were some people actually, and some bars and clubs that came back in West Berlin. I mean, after the Nazis from that period, West Berlin is like one big flea market. I mean, there were every third shop, it seems, was selling like antiques and used books and used furniture and used appliances and this kind of thing. And you could find, if you combed them finely enough, I mean, you could find these clothes from the 20s and the 30s. I mean, I know people who went to all the flea markets and just to find those kinds of things. And so, and right around the corner from me today, in this neighborhood where I am, there's a shop that sells vintage clothing from the Germany, pre-war Germany. So the myths, I think, were really important. That Berlin has so long been a really special place for good reasons and bad. That it's a place of extremes. That it's intensely political. That it's a place where you can make it happen. You can make your own thing happen if you really want it badly enough. One myth. I mean, the myth, for example, of Christiane F. She was a young woman in West Berlin, late 70s, 80s, who became a teenage heroin addict and prostitute. And she wrote this really famous book that I'll bet most people of your generation don't know, but everybody read it in the 1980s. It was called We the Children of Bahnhof Zoo. And again, here's a young woman just kind of going way out on the edge. Getting hooked on heroin and becoming a prostitute at the age like 13 or 14. And this book sold millions of copies worldwide. I mean, it was read in West Germany in schools as kind of a warning. What happens if you get into heroin or whatever. And in fact, many young women who were like living in wholly boring provincial places, they were like, oh, I'm getting out of here. I'm going to Bahnhof Zoo and I'm going to become a prostitute and a heroin addict too. There were a lot of people who copied it, this kind of like, caution to the wind, very radical, very extreme, and exactly that kind of a mythos kept kind of, were currents that stream through the subcultures. Particularly in the 70s, 80s, 90s, and for some people like myself, still today. I mean, every time I go to Bahnhof Zoo, I peek a little bit behind in kind of the underpasses, and it's not the case that they're there anymore. But until very recently, there were still kids there, selling heroin and throwing up.
Mm-hmm. Paul, I would like to share just a little bit of the research that I had an opportunity to see related to subcultures. So one of the principles, or one of the conclusions, was that if we look at the subcultures like in general, that there are almost no people today in the world that would not be a part of this or that subculture.
Yeah.
The thing is that some people might not call that a subculture, but like we all, apart from our professional activities, we all search for something. And for instance, some people do the very extreme sports, which makes a certain subculture of extreme. So do you agree with this basically statement that there are almost no people today in the world that are not adherents of a subculture? They might know it, or they might be aware of it, or they may not
be. Yeah, because I mean, because everybody's different, and professions are different, and places are different, and culture is much more fragmented than we give it credit for. And I think the difference, though, is what subcultures are really interesting. I mean, you could be a hairdresser or something, and then you are of a certain subculture of culture of hairdressers that not everybody else is, and so you can say it's kind of a subculture. It's just not a very interesting one. Well, that's not exactly. I mean, there's a subculture of hairdressers that's also very interesting in Berlin. I mean, this is one of the kind of the small shops that are set up by really funky people that give you really funky haircuts, and they still exist in Berlin. I think that I think that some subcultures are deeper and simply more innovative and more extreme in that they bump up against that there's opposition to some of the cultural norms, and that they challenge them in a more radical way, and so I think that's at least the kind of subcultures that I find most interesting.
Paul, is there anything that you'd like to add on the topic, something maybe that I did not ask?
Well, let me just say this about Berlin, and that is, it's there's been a process of normalization over the past 25 years. And the neighborhood, for example, that I live in right now, Prenzlauer Berg, it had been the center of Berlin subculture after the wall fell. And it was just fantastic. All of these, like, walk these streets, it was like canyons of turn of the century, brick and plaster housing buildings that were falling down. It was only probably about 50% populated. There were still coal ovens in the apartments, and it was actually where people who made a lot of people were unemployed, people were poor, people weren't a member of the Communist Party lived. Anybody who possibly could would go to one of the high rises that were built around Berlin that had indoor plumbing and heating and things like this. I mean, a lot of the places, even in West Berlin, did not have an indoor toilet. The toilets were in the hallway, and you shared them with somebody else. I mean, it's unreal but it was indeed the case, and maybe until about 10 years ago. So what we've seen in Berlin has three things. One, there's been gentrification. Lots of people have come from Western Germany and elsewhere, and all kinds of companies and firms have come. I mean, in the old days, you didn't know anybody who had a quote unquote normal job. I didn't know anybody who knew anybody who had a normal job. If you wanted to make a career, you wouldn't be in West Berlin. You would go to West Germany. And so that's, of course, completely changed. And so the gentrification has driven up prices for housing, and there's ever less Freiraum or free space. So it's a lot harder. That said, it still exists. You just have to go a little bit further outside of Berlin in order to access it. I mean, a second thing that happened is that there's been a kind of a commodification of subculture. So just for example, the whole graffiti subculture, graffiti writers in Berlin. That was a special Berlin thing because you had the wall, and because you could, for 100 miles, you could put as much graffiti up as you want, and nobody cared. It was just it was the longest, biggest open air gallery in the world. It was just fantastic to take long afternoon walks along the wall and just look at all the art. But now Berlin has used this idea of a radical offbeat Berlin. Berlin has this reputation, and it uses it in order to attract tourists, for example, lots and lots of tourists. And yeah, I mean, this is just for an example, like, there's some stores that, although they would actually wipe off the graffiti put up by graffiti writers and street artists, they would pay a street artist to put the kind of street art they want on their building. And this happens a lot. And this is actually what Berlin is. Because Berlin, after the wall fell, the different mayors and the elite, they tried in many different ways to kind of find a Berlin that was going to sell. They're like, Berlin, it's going to be the new financial center of Germany. It'd be like a second Frankfurt, and we'll have the biggest airport and things like this. And none of it happened. And as it turned out, because there was so many spaces, a lot of artists came from different places. Also, a lot of young people who wanted to start their own, thing, their own business. And so this small startup culture also had space. And, it wasn't until Berlin's mayor, and he was gay, which was important also to Berlin's idea. He realized finally, Berlin is poor but sexy. Arm aber sexy. And this then caught on. And this became the selling point of Berlin. It was poor but sexy. And today it's no longer poor and it's less sexy. But it's those and the tourists are also huge. In the West Berlin days, there were only tourists would come and watch that and come and look at the wall. There's really nothing else to do. There weren't even that many hotels. There weren't even that many good restaurants in West Berlin. And that is all very, very, very different now. So what I say about Berlin today is that there's still room to do your own thing if you really want to do it. But it does mean making sacrifices, as it did in the past as well. To live through a Berlin winter in an apartment that was never warm. I don't think there weren't any really decent restaurants. There were two kinds of coffee. It was rough in different very many ways to live in West Berlin. But if you could hack it, then if you had enough belief in what you were doing, then you would stay and you would make it happen. And I think that current still exists. We've seen Berlin reinvent itself many times throughout history. And so I am of the impression that it is possible today, and that we don't really know what's around the corner.
Thank you so much for the interview, Paul. It was a pleasure.